G'day, my name's Alex Dudley. You might have seen me on Australian Story with my wife Jane, and we were on Australian Story I think in August 2025, and the episode was called Gut Instinct. And the reason we were on Australian Story is because we cured Jane's bipolar disorder, and saying cure and bipolar disorder in the same sentence is going to trigger a few people, I think. But firstly, what I want to do is say I am not involved in the wellness industry at all. I do not like the wellness industry. I guess the stop the clock's right twice a day, so there's probably some things in there that are probably actually helpful to people. But it's actually, in terms of economics, as big as a grift as, big pharma or whatever conspiracy you want to throw out there. I believe in science. I believe in pursuing science. I believe in the scientific method. I believe in testing a hypothesis. I do not believe that causality is the be all. There's a lot of things going on. I'm going to have to edit this out. So correlation is not causality necessarily. That's basically what I'm trying to say. But I stand by my claim that I cured my wife's bipolar disorder, and we did this through fecal micro. I stand by my claim that I cured my wife's bipolar disorder, and we did this through fecal microbiome transplants. Now, we were the first people in the world, as far as we can tell, to use fecal transplants for a mental health condition. And to give you a bit of a background, in case you haven't seen the Australian Story, and I will leave a link to that story in the show notes, I guess you call it. The way that I came about this bizarre cure using poo transplants to cure my wife's mental illness is out of desperation. So my wife had treatment-resistant bipolar disorder. She was on 3 medications that helped. I do not advise anyone to go off their meds without talking at length with their psychiatrists and being monitored. But she was very, very ill. She had very, very severe depression most of the time, and occasionally something had happened and she would spiral off into psychosis. And she visited hospitals quite a number of times for psychosis or suicidal depression. And she was actually on the disability support pension, and I was essentially her carer. It actually took me quite a while to realise how sick she was and how unwell and how much she was suffering, because she was good at masking, as a lot of people with bipolar disorder are. But once I realised how unwell she was and what hell she was living in, I knew that this wasn't a sustainable disease and that she would eventually probably take her own life, and that is not something I wanted to happen. Basically, I came to the conclusion that fecal transplants might help. It was a long process. I knew, for example, from the research that I'd done, that serotonin and dopamine are largely created as byproducts of a healthy gut microbiome, and I knew that her not having serotonin and dopamine were the main reasons why she was severely depressed. If she got out of bed before midday, that was definitely regarded as a win. I knew that without serotonin and dopamine, she couldn't actually feel motivation or joy or get a sense of satisfaction from any task that she completed. So it was a really, really horrible existence. But I was like, okay, if these things are created in the gut, what's going on? And I knew that stress as a kid, like she had what are often referred to as adverse childhood events, would flood the gut microbiome with cortisol, and that would have caused a lot of issues. but I also knew that she had been on a course of antibiotics for like nearly 2 years, like the extended course of antibiotics for chronic tonsillitis, and that would have absolutely smashed her microbiome. And I figured if that had occurred, how would she get those microbes back? How would she get her gut functioning so that it was producing serotonin and dopamine again? And to me, the logical step was actually fecal transplants. And then I actually read a study that came out of the Cryon lab in Cork University in Ireland about, it was called Transferring the Blues, and I'll see if I can leave a link in the show notes once again. It involved giving germ-free mice the feces of people with depression, and the mice developed depression. And I was like, well, depression seems to be a gut issue, you know, so I thought fecal transplants might take the edge off my wife's bipolar disorder, off her depression. I didn't think it would actually cure a bipolar disorder. That was beyond my wildest dreams. But anyway, there were no protocols, there were no precedents. The only thing we had to go on was people who were using fecal transplants to treat a bacterial overgrowth, which is Clostridium difficile, now known as Clostridioides difficile, I believe. And that overgrowth can be fatal. The treatment is very, very expensive, but there were people using other people's feces to treat it sort of at home, because in the USA, because of course everything that involves health treatments in the USA is extremely expensive. But we looked at how they did it, and we looked at how to do it safely, and we figured that if I didn't have any nasty diseases and I'd been tested before for STIs and things like that before I got into the relationship with Jane, and we'd already, you know, been together for a number of years, we figured that the risks were actually low. Knowing what I know now, this is an extremely dangerous procedure, potentially, if your donor isn't absolutely thoroughly screened, because we know not only can STIs and parasites and viruses all be transmitted through fecal transplant, but conditions like depression and other mental illnesses can almost certainly be transmitted through fecal transplant. So it's not a condition that you want to treat lightly. And one of the things I really want to make sure happens is eventually this treatment is made available safely. I cannot emphasize safely enough. So I don't want people to go out and do this at home like we did. We were bloody idiots. We were very lucky, but we were idiots to do it without me getting tested, I should say, thoroughly beforehand. I have been tested since, and it turns out that I'm fine as a donor, although now I'm apparently too old. And I did have a parasite called Blastocystis hominis, and at one stage I did actually get hookworms as well, which I was treated for, and then that came back clear between donating to somebody else. So what I want to talk about is what is the microbiome and why is it important and how can we look after it. And this is something that I'm sure Jane will want to get into at some stage as well. But a microbiome, we're basically, as a human being, we're covered in microbiomes. Trees have bark microbiomes, they have root microbiomes, there are microbiomes in the soil. It's basically an ecological community made up of organisms that are too small to see. And the reason that I believe a lot of inflammatory and autoimmune diseases are spiking, and I regard depression as an inflammatory disease, is because our human microbiome is becoming less diverse. So if you look at our evolutionary history, we've always been a mouth and a butthole and a tube running between those two orifices with a whole bunch of organisms living in that tube. And they're not just passive passengers, and they're not just parasites. These are part of us. These are part of the ecological community that makes up a human being, and they've evolved alongside us, and we have evolved alongside them. And having a diversity of gut microbes gives us resilience. It's a huge, important part of our immune system. And it is basically a part of our interaction with the outside world. It is our first line of defense in a lot of ways. And it actually interacts with the brain via the gut-brain axis, which is mainly through the vagus nerve, which is thought to be the primary route of signalling between the brain and the gut. But also through the lining of the gut and the blood-brain barrier as well. So the gut's often referred to as the second brain. But what's going on in the gut is there's an ecological system of great diversity. Now, what's been happening with the human microbiome and ecology generally, biodiversity generally, is you imagine you're flying in a 747 aircraft, okay, an airliner. You're whizzing across the sky. Hello, little fly. You're whizzing across the sky, and you pull out your Leatherman or your multi-tool, and you start pulling off panels on the inside of the aircraft and cutting wires and cutting hoses. Now, something like a 747 has got a huge amount of redundancy built into it, so the plane's not likely to actually fall out of the sky, certainly not straight away. But what cutting those hoses and those wires and pulling those parts out and throwing them out of the plane, what that is actually doing is it's making it's removing those redundant systems, and it means if there is a shock, if the plane runs into turbulence or whatever, the plane is more likely to fall out of the sky. You know, the more components you pull out, the more likely it is that thing's actually going to fall out of the sky and crash. Well, unfortunately, we're doing exactly the same thing with global biodiversity and with our gut microbiome. And we're doing that by eating ultra-processed food. We're consuming preservatives, we're drinking alcohol, which is used as an antimicrobial. We're taking antibiotics far more often than we should do, and the actual number of different plant species that we've been eating has reduced over time. So all this means that our gut microbiome has actually become less diverse over time and less resilient, and that means that we are more likely to get sick if there's any shocks to the system. So looking after your gut becomes very, very, very important. So that's a little bit about the microbiome and a little bit about the assaults that are occurring, and it'll give you an idea of how replacing somebody's unhealthy microbiome with a healthy microbiome might actually help with a mental health condition or other health conditions. And for a really long time, psychiatrists have looked at mental illnesses as something that's just happened in their head. They're head doctors, if you like. They're heads and meds. That's basically what psychiatry has been about for a very, very long time. But Professor Felice Jacka at the Food and Mood Centre at Deakin University basically came up with the field of nutritional psychiatry. And nutritional psychiatry is looking at the interaction of the gut microbiome and mental health. And the studies that they've come up with have shown very clearly that what goes on in your gut can have a profound effect on what goes on in your brain. And there's a bunch of other studies that have popped up all over the world that are now starting to look at the relationship, if you like, between gut microbiome that's in dysbiosis and diseases that we haven't historically thought have been connected to the gut. And they include things like, severe autism spectrum disorders, which isn't necessarily, something that's actually a disease, but it is on a spectrum, and there are people who really struggle to function normally on one end of that spectrum. Parkinson's disease, rheumatoid arthritis. So a whole bunch of autoimmune conditions, multiple sclerosis, are now being linked with the gut microbiome. The difficulty is that studies that look at treating the gut microbiome are in their infancy. And when you're looking at something like bipolar disorder, it's so out there to think that you could treat bipolar disorder with a fecal transplant that it has been dismissed. So Jane, my wife, has been well since 2017. Since September 2017, she has needed no psychiatric medications, and she has had no psychiatric symptoms. She's had no symptoms of bipolar whatsoever. Prior to this treatment, which began in November 2016, if she missed any of her 3 medications for more than 2 days, she would be in a psych ward, and by the end of the week. Like, she was really, really unwell, and those psych medications were what was basically keeping her on the track, but it was a very unpleasant track. She needed them. They saved her life. Don't go off your meds. But what is cured? People are saying, oh, you haven't cured. She's just gone into remission. How do you define cured if you can do that with bipolar 1 disorder? This isn't a placebo. Not for nearly 9 years. This is, a really serious treatment. So I desperately want to see clinical trials funded for treating mental health conditions, including major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder, using fecal transplants. I want to see this done safely. I want to see random controlled trials, and I want to see these treatments being made available to others, because my wife isn't the only person who's successfully treated a bipolar disorder with fecal transplants now. So it costs, these diseases cost Australia billions of dollars. A clinical trial costs $10 million. Someone out there, please fund these trials. It's extremely important. And with that, I'll finish up.